Hello everyone, Ben DeBono here from the Sci-Fi Christian to talk to you about the first 9 cantos of Dante's Purgatorio. That's right, we are now into part 2 of the Divine Comedy. We are out of hell and ready to make our way up the treacherously high and steep Mount Purgatory that awaits us before we can finally get into heaven and see Beatrice and all that good stuff that will await us at the end of this third part. But for now, at least for the next few weeks, this is where we are going to be. Lots to talk about this week. I know we had a little bit less to read this week. We only read through Canto 9, so a bit lighter than I think we've been doing like 12, 13 cantos or something the last few weeks as we made our way through Inferno. So a little bit lighter this week. And by the way, I'd like to mention this both at the beginning and end of the videos. For next time, read through Canto 19. Canto 19 by next Friday, what would that be? Today's 19th, so the 26th, so Canto 19 of Purgatorio. But we had less to read this week, but I don't think we have any less to talk about. We're certainly not going to get through it all. There's just tons to cover here, so let's not waste any time. Let's dive right in. I think the first thing that I wanted to cover before we kind of give a brief synopsis is maybe to address right up front the whole purgatory issue. Because, having been an evangelical for most of my life, and now being a Catholic, I understand both sides of the thought process when it comes to something like purgatory. And from an evangelical perspective, or a Protestant perspective, I think purgatory, theologically, this is something that when we get to this middle part of the Divine Comedy, we're not always quite comfortable with if you're coming at it from that perspective. We're okay with the concept of hell, at least in the sense that, I don't mean we're jumping up and down for joy about it, but at least in the sense that a doctrine of hell feels Christian. We're comfortable with Christians believing that, and most Christians themselves are going to believe some variation of the doctrine of hell. Even though, we obviously recognize that Dante's using a great deal of poetic license, nobody, including Dante, thinks that that's a literal depiction of what hell is going to look like, but nevertheless, we're comfortable with the concept of hell. And on the other side, of course, we're comfortable with the concept of heaven or paradise, or whatever you want to call it. But in the middle there, we have purgatory, which is extremely controversial, especially in discussions between Catholics and Protestants. I know there are some Protestants, including C.S. Lewis, who would embrace the doctrine of purgatory. But by and large, most Protestants would say, no, that's not something that we believe. And indeed, when I was going through my conversion process and I was researching Catholicism, it's something that I was prepared to wrestle with a great deal in terms of, what do I think of this? And is that something I can believe in? And much to my surprise, I actually found this doctrine of purgatory is far more controversial than it needs to be. Let me explain. I don't think that, there are legitimate differences between Catholic and Protestant belief. Of course there are. And nobody should minimize those, even as we try to treat each other with respect and listen to one another. But we certainly shouldn't minimize our differences. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. But I don't think that purgatory needs to be one of those differences. Let me explain by asking 2 questions. First question would be, do you think that when you are in heaven, you will be sinless? You won't sin anymore? And I think the obvious answer that all or most Christians would give is yes. We're going to be sinless in heaven, of course. Do you think, this would be question number 2, that everyone who dies and goes to heaven is sinless at the moment of their death? And this one's maybe a little trickier, but I think by and large the answer is no. If I go out driving tonight and I get hit by a bus and die, I'm not perfect, I'm not sinless right now in March of 2015. I'm working on it. I got a lifetime of work to go, right? And most of us aren't ever going to get there. So, okay. So I think most Christians would be comfortable answering yes to those two questions. If you answered yes to those two questions, your beliefs, whatever they happen to be, fit within the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. They do. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory is actually very, very unspecific about what this looks like. All it says, if you read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, all it says about purgatory is that those who die as Christians, those who die in God's friendship, I believe is the language it uses. In other words, somebody who dies and is going to go to heaven will be cleansed of their sins. And what that looks like is open to discussion within Catholicism. In other words, it could be an instantaneous cleansing where, you're dead 1 second and then the next second you're purely cleansed or purged of your sin and in heaven with God. Or it could be, a longer spiritual process. It could be an entirely, a third afterlife place, kind of like what Dante is envisioning. Catholic belief allows for a range of opinions on that. So I think where the difference would come is that Protestants probably aren't comfortable with a range of opinions on that. They would rule out there being an actual literal purgatory place people go to. But nevertheless, I don't think that's worth fighting about. And I think it's worth saying that, we can agree on 95% of this doctrine. Simply being, the basis of this doctrine is that if we don't die perfect, God's going to cleanse us of our sins on our way up to heaven, whatever that looks like. And what I would say then is, as you're reading this part of Dante, understand that it's a metaphor for that. It's a metaphor for sanctification, whether or not sanctification occurs in this life or the next. It's a metaphor for whatever that process looks like. You don't have to believe in a literal purgatory dimension, for lack of a better term, any more than you have to believe in a geocentric universe such as the one that Dante portrays. Okay? It's just, so don't, I spend a little time on this up front because I don't want this to be a distraction for my Protestant friends who are reading this. Don't feel like now you're in Catholic la-la land just because we're talking about purgatories. No, we're actually pretty much on the same page here. Okay? We really are. And it's okay to not agree on all of the details, but the general sense being expressed in the doctrine of purgatory and in Dante's writing about it is that we need cleansing of our sins, even as Christians, right? And that's a real process that Christians have to go through, whether in this life or the next, whether it's instantaneous after death or whether it's a process after death, whether the people on earth have the ability to influence that through their prayers or not. Those are all details we can disagree about, but the meat of the doctrine we don't disagree about. So let's not let that be a distraction when it comes to us being able to appreciate the art and the theology that Dante is trying to get across here. All right, so brief summary then, and I will try and be brief because there's not, I spent a great deal of time on that at the beginning, but it's important. We've climbed up Satan's hairy body, and now we are out into the wide open area, and that's really the first thing you notice, right? Is the constant looking up at the stars and everything, and Dante is just taking it all in, and Virgil right along with him. Hell has that stifling feel in Dante that you almost don't even notice because it just becomes so familiar by the end of it. But the second you're free of it, just like deep breath of air, it's like we have room to breathe again, we're out here, and everything's going to be okay. And we meet Cato from, who was a member of ancient Rome, who's actually committed suicide, so there's some controversy about why Dante lets him be out of hell and here in purgatory, but we won't get into all of that, except to say that it's another example of Dante's partisan belief in the gloria and importance and indeed providential nature of the Roman Empire, which of course would be a whole different set of videos to dive into that whole deal. And Cato, says, hey, what are you guys doing here? People don't usually come out that way. Virgil says, where this has been willed from on high. It was like, okay, go at it, but wash yourself clean. Here we get the other half of that metaphor as Dante goes down to the river Lathe and cleanses himself of the grime and dirt of hell, and that's of course what's flowing back down into Satan. We'll get more of the river Lathe at the top of Purgatory, but we'll see that a little bit. And he picks off the reed, which grows back, so there's a miraculous sign. We are not in Kansas anymore, and Kansas in this case would of course be the horrifying Inferno. This is a place where miracles happen, but it's also a place of humility, which is what most people think that little reed symbolizes. All right, then we have the ferryman, not Charon from the river Acheron, who we saw in hell, but a different ferryman, an angelic ferryman, carrying people down the Tiber to the shores of Purgatory. And then up the mountain we go, and there's a few cantos there, which I'll talk about more in a second as we get into some of the symbolism. But for the most part, then, we spend the rest of these first 9 cantos outside of the gates of Purgatory. So we are dealing with a number of people who have to kind of wait for a while before they actually get to begin their purgatory adventure. We have the excommunicated those who have been excommunicated from the church, they get to hang around and wait 30 times as long as they spent outside of the church. We have the lazy who are doing what they do best, absolutely nothing. They have those who died by violence, so they didn't receive their last rites, but they, had a prayer to God on their lips for forgiveness as they died. And then rulers who were more interested in earthly politics, but were nonetheless members of the church, saved and all that. So they're heading their way up the mountain. And then we get to the gate of Purgatory, and Dante gets 7 P's carved on his forehead. And he's told when you get inside, make sure you get those washed off. P, by the way, is carved onto his forehead because in Italian, and you probably saw this if you're reading some of your notes in your edition, is the first letter of the Italian word for sin. So, if Dante was English, it would have been 7 S's. Okay? And of course, you probably made the obvious connection between 7 P's for sins and 7 deadly sins. Yes, we're going to have 1 terrace in Purgatory for each of the 7 deadly sins, and that's going to be most of the rest of the way for Purgatory. There's also the interesting canto, I believe it's 7 or 8, where we have the serpent attack. And of course the symbolism there, I think even Dante says, you'd have to be kind of dense not to get the metaphor I'm going for here of the serpents coming to attack the faithful outside of Purgatory, and the angels come down and defend. All right, so what I went through that summary very quickly because it's almost difficult to talk about the plot because outside of talking about the symbols. And that's going to be the case really from here on out in the Divine Comedy. The plot itself gets less and less and less, and we're drawn into a more symbolic, contemplative state and that's very intentional on Dante's part. If the Inferno is narrative heavy, it's narrative heavy because everybody's focused on themselves. Everybody's focused on their own small and pathetic stories. We'll still hear stories of people, but really things are more focused on what's to come. And I owe this observation to my friend Ben Kirkwold, who does the Game of Thrones videos with me, where he's been reading the Divine Comedy and pointing out, wow, when you get to Purgatorio, it's like when you're in Inferno, it's all focused on right where you are. There's no sense of perspective. But the second Purgatorio starts, it's constant. We're looking up at the stars, which, as we'll find later, is where paradise is and God is eventually in the Divine Comedy. We're looking up the height of the mountain. It's all about let's go, we're going to make it. This is going to happen. We are going to meet Beatrice. We are going to be saved. There's a sense of, the exact inverse of what we saw with the Inferno, where we're no longer navel gazing, but we are focused on something beyond ourselves. We still have work to do. There's still sin that needs to be taken care of, but there's a sense of freedom and relief that's going on here. You'll also notice there's a lot of language connecting this, what's going on in Purgatorio, with a pilgrimage. Now, this would have been very obvious to Dante's immediate audience because pilgrimages took place all the time. You'd get a group of guys together, or you'd go yourself and make a pilgrimage to some holy shrine of a saint, or, a holy place, or what have you, and that's part of your spiritual journey. It's a common enough occurrence in Dante's world that one of his contemporaries, or near contemporaries anyway, Geoffrey Chaucer, is able to use the concept of pilgrimage as a backdrop to the Canterbury Tales. And so everybody who's sitting there reading the Canterbury Tales, which are, again, aren't about a pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is only the framing device. Everybody would have been able to just understand immediately what was going on there. For us, it's a little less common. But you'll understand this in the language as you read Purgatorio, that Virgil and Dante are always describing themselves as, pilgrims and all that. You have groups of people walking together, and everybody's singing. Dante doesn't actually put the songs in, but he'll make references to, the Miserere, or however you pronounce that, which is a song based on Psalm 51, have mercy on me, O God. And, so they're singing the Psalms, they're singing spiritual songs as they're making this pilgrimage up through their sanctification. And in that sense, it also has a very liturgical character, where if the Inferno was kind of an anti-liturgy, if you will, it's everybody focused on themselves. It's everybody focused on their own sin and on this punishment, and it's horrible. Where this is a liturgy, where, especially if you've ever attended a Catholic Mass or an Eastern Orthodox Mass, or even a highly liturgical Protestant service, you understand that there's a sense of build-up to the moment of the Eucharist that's going on in Catholic liturgy. And that's what's going on in Purgatorio. This is a sense of anticipation and build-up for the eventual meeting with Beatrice, which would be the metaphor of the moment of consecration of the Eucharist as we move into paradise in the third part of the Divine Comedy. So this is all about preparation for what's to come. You'll notice, too, that if Virgil is decidedly less confident and sure of himself in the Purgatorio than he was in Inferno. Dante asks him, how do we get up the mountain? He goes, well, let's keep looking. There's got to be a way up somewhere. Let's ask these guys if they know where to go. That type of thing. Why? Well, remember that Virgil is the metaphor for human reason, and human reason has its limits. It will eventually have its limits when Beatrice takes over guiding Dante in the last several cantos of Purgatorio, and Virgil will exit the story. But even now we're starting to see its limits. We're entering into places that are beyond what human reason can comprehend, that are going to require a more contemplative heart, that's going to require the eyes of the Holy Spirit guiding us. It's going to require us to be submissive to that which is beyond ourselves as human, and maybe draw us into an uncomfortable place. So there's a lot going on here metaphorically. This is a very metaphor, not that the Inferno wasn't, of course, but I think trying to think of a way to phrase it to differentiate the two. But in Purgatory, it's the Inferno is maybe a metaphor for ourselves, in our sinful nature, the dead end of humanity, if you will, left to its own devices. Whereas the metaphor in Purgatorio is a metaphor that points us beyond ourselves. It points us beyond even the literary concerns of narrative, and that's part of why I think people tend to struggle with the second two parts of the Divine Comedy, is that kind of step back from the excitement, if you will, of there's somebody getting hacked alive by a demon with a sword, fades into something more spiritual, less thrilling, if you will, and something that you really have to submit to rather than just pick up and enjoy because of the, no, that's so disgusting quality that you get in the Inferno. All right, so that's some of what's going on metaphorically and symbolically in these first 9 cantos. As far as a Lenten reflection for this week, I'll tell you what really hit me. Uh, and again, I'm reading these in parallel, so different translations of parallels. Part of what I'm looking for is that if I read a part 3 times, 4 times in the course of the week, what's really standing out to me? And I'll tell you what stood out to me every time I passed it this week, which is Dante's conversation with the lazy, who are just laying around and everything. Uh, and he asks them, you know, why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you moving forward? It's like, oh, well, we can't. And then the lazy guy, I forget his name, but it's one of Dante's friends, rattles off a seemingly legitimate reason for why we can't. He says, well, even if I got up to the door, the gate with the angel, he's not going to let me in. It's going to require prayers of, people back on earth. That's my only hope I've got because I was lazy in life, and so my punishment is to just lay around here, tell enough people, pray me up to the gate of purgatory, and I'm good to go. And on the surface, it's a legitimate explanation. And on the surface, I think Dante actually believes that theologically. That would be a legitimate, or maybe not believes it theologically in the sense that that's dogmatically what he thinks is going to happen to the lazy when they get to purgatory, but he believes it as a realistic punishment for the lazy in terms of purgatory. But if you dig deeper, there's more going on than just that in that example. And to really dig deeper, you have to take that conversation between him and the lazy guy and put it in the context of his conversation with the angel at the gate of purgatory, who has the keys, St. Peter's keys to heaven. And he says, oh, yeah, when Peter dropped these off before he headed up to his spot in heaven, he told me to be, err on the side of being too permissive rather than too stingy. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to draw a connection between those two conversations, because what the angel is essentially saying is, yes, there are rules, but there's grace here as well. There's mercy here as well for those who are willing to truly ask for it. And of course, that we enter into the realm of narrative speculation here, but I can't help feeling like maybe Dante wants us to make a connection there that says that, okay, if the lazy, they might technically be right in their justification. Their justification for why they've got to just sit there on the side of the mountain might technically work in terms of how the laws of purgatory work. But what if they did get themselves up to the gate? And what if on hands and knees they begged the angel for the grace and mercy to let them in, let them begin their journey? Would they be denied? Maybe, because those are the rules, but maybe not. I think that I bring this up too, and this resonates with me because spiritual sloth is a big problem for us today. At least it is for me. I see it in myself. I see it in people around me, and it manifests itself in a number of different ways. How hard is it for us to stick to spiritual disciplines? It's very hard. I think, anyway, very hard. I think we find that at Lent. How many of us have been perfect with our Lenten fast or whatever? I haven't. I've tried. But there's a laziness inside of me that has caused me to mess up at times this Lent. How many of us are perfect in terms of not only going to church or to Mass, but to truly submitting ourselves to what God has for us there? I'm not. There have been times where going to Mass and sitting in the liturgy is as powerful experience as I've ever had, and other times where I'm just mouthing along the words, on autopilot, thinking about what I'm going to do when I get home. I think another way that this manifests for us is that our spiritual lives, at least in our culture today, are very up and down. It's like, and anybody who grew up in a church going to youth group knows what I'm talking about. Like, you go to the youth group retreat and everybody there, goes up for the altar call or whatever and gives their lives to Christ yet again. You're on that, you're way up here, and then a week goes later, and you're down there. And I think for a lot of us, that kind of tendency of up and down, we wait for the mountaintop experience, we come down, and manifests itself just constantly in our spiritual lives. I think it can be a temptation in worship services, and I don't say this to pick on my Protestant friends or anything like that. And having sat in a lot of worship services for my life, it's something that really bothered me when I was an evangelical, that, we try and really get the emotion going. And so we want to get up here, but, and then Monday comes, or Sunday afternoon comes, we're back down there. And that, to me, is a form of spiritual laziness, where to make our spiritual lives work, we wait for that next shot in the arm. We wait for, to use Dante's metaphor of the guy laying there on the side of the Mountain of Purgatory, we wait for the next bit of prayers to come along and, get us up to that much higher on the mountain. And I've become convinced that the spiritual life, it's going to have times where you're way up here, and it's going to have times where you're way down here. That's humanity. But most of life is meant to be lived here. Not with these huge dive and wave, but with, a small rhythm to our life. And we don't do that because it takes work. And to be honest, even though this is more exhausting in some ways, it doesn't take a lot of work on our part, because what we do is we wind up just staying down here till the next big retreat comes up, till we really feel God's presence one day, and then we're up here, till the next exciting worship song comes on the radio, or, comes into your service, then we're up here. To play fair, because I was, picking on a Protestant service a little bit more, we Catholics, of course, are guilty of this too. We wait till the next exciting liturgical feast comes along, and then we're up here because it's Easter, or, it's the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin, or something like that. We're all guilty of it. And it's laziness, it's sloth. And like the person on the side of the mountain, I think we're good at coming up with excuses and saying, well, the reason for that is blah, 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 blah. I'm busy, I got a family and all that. I don't have time to necessarily put in the effort to live my life here. And maybe some of those excuses are legitimate. But we forget that there's grace waiting for us, and we forget that if we go down on our hands and knees for the angel at the gate and say, let me in, before God or before our Christian brothers and sisters, or whatever that looks like, there's grace waiting for us there. And is it going to work every time like a charm? No. No, because some of the excuses we give are legitimate. But is it going to work some of the time? Is it worth the effort? Is it worth, as Jesus told us, to pray unceasingly? Of course. And we don't. I don't. I'm guessing you don't. And so we have to be honest about that. Don't be the dude at the side of the mountain, just laying there, waiting for someone to pray you into purgatory. Get off your butt and go do it yourself. But don't do it because I gave you a rah-rah speech about it and you watched a video that's got you excited then. It's got you up here. No. Do it because you want to live here, in the middle, with the small rhythm of life. Don't be a manic Christian. Don't be a manic person, for that matter. Because, of course, that pattern is indicative of our culture, too, isn't it? Right? We get excited about the next big thing rather than, embracing the rhythm of life. Anyway, I could go on about that for much, much longer. Probably already went on too long about it. But if you made it this far, you're almost halfway through the Divine Comedy. You're doing great. I hope you're enjoying it, all of you out there. Again, through Canto 19 of Purgatorio by next week. And by the way, I mentioned last time that Matt and I were recording an episode for the podcast on Inferno. That's going to be released next week sometime. It's going to be episode 341. So go out on the website and take a look at that. We had a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed listening to Matt's perspective on the Inferno as somebody who's, first-time reader to it. I was able to share some stuff that I didn't have time to share in the videos. Of course, there's some overlap and all that. But I'm really, really proud of that episode. So I would encourage you, if you're reading along with the Divine Comedy, take the time to go download that. I think you'll enjoy it and will help supplement some of our conversation here. Maybe you think, oh, it doesn't need it because I'm just blabbing on for so long, of course, which I am. But, there's, of course, so much more to be said about Dante than what we have time for, even in these much too long videos. All right. So that's it for now. I'll be back next week to talk to you about Cantos 10 through 19. But until then, I'm Ben DeCono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian. Goodbye.